Have you gotten permission from the person who owns this place?" Those were the words I spoke to my daughter-in-law as I stood there staring at her. "Luggage. Have you even bothered to ask the homeowner if this is acceptable?" The question emerged from my lips with a steadiness that caught me off guard. I'd only just pushed open the entrance to my apartment. Plastic shopping bags still dangling from both forearms, and there she stood, Chloe, the woman my son married, positioned directly in the center of my living space as though her presence there were perfectly ordinary. At her feet sat two massive pieces of luggage, and her face displayed a combination of shock and something far less pleasant irritation. It was as if my unexpected arrival had interrupted some perfectly orchestrated scheme. Her eyes lifted to meet mine. She blinked a couple of times, then released one of those tense little chuckles she always used whenever someone challenged her behavior. It was brief and pointed, specifically crafted to make whoever questioned her feel absurd, yet I refused to break eye contact. I remained positioned at the entrance of my own residence, gripping the weighted bags full of fresh vegetables and preserved goods, waiting for a response she obviously hadn't rehearsed that. "Oh, Ava, I didn't realize you'd come back already." Her tone carried an airy, almost melodic quality, as though we were engaged in some light-hearted chat about weather conditions, as though the suitcases were invisible, as though it were entirely unremarkable for her to be occupying my apartment on a Thursday afternoon with zero advance warning, no request for approval, no hint of acknowledgement that this space belonged to me, my sanctuary, the single location on earth where I could still draw breath without constant demands from everyone around me. I held my position. I stayed precisely where I was at the doorway, sensing the burden of the grocery bags, starting to create crimson indentations on my skin. Yet I refused to lower them. Something within me had solidified the exact instant I spotted those suitcases, something that had been malleable, compliant, perpetually prepared to surrender. After so many years, I'd finally discovered a line I wouldn't cross. I posed a question to you, Chloe. My tone emerged more assertively this time. She swept a piece of her impeccably arranged hair behind one ear, executing that maneuver she performed whenever she required additional time to formulate her response. Her eyes, decorated with subtle cosmetics that complemented her expensive blouse, evaded mine momentarily before returning with that slight, patronizing grin I found utterly revolting. "Ava, honestly, don't blow this out of proportion. Dion and I just require accommodation for a couple of days. Our place is undergoing construction, and the racket is absolutely intolerable. The workers arrive at 6 in the morning and remain until 7 at night. Sleep is impossible. Work is impossible. Living under those conditions is impossible. We figured staying here wouldn't create any issues. After all, you reside alone and possess 2 bedrooms that sit completely unused." There it was, that single statement which flawlessly encapsulated my family's perception of me. You reside alone and possess rooms gathering dust, as though my existence were some vacant container waiting to be occupied by everyone else's requirements, as though the reality that nobody was occupying the adjacent bedrooms automatically transformed my residence into a communal resource accessible to whoever required it, as though my 68 years of living didn't earn me the authority to determine how, when, and with whom I shared my environment. I finally stepped fully inside and deposited the bags onto my dining surface. The noise of the canned items striking the wooden table resonated more prominently than I'd anticipated. Chloe retreated a single step, almost imperceptibly, yet I detected it. Her physical demeanor had shifted. She no longer appeared quite so comfortable. The discomfort was beginning to penetrate the facade of confidence she perpetually displayed. I positioned myself beside the table, refraining from unpacking the groceries, not progressing toward the kitchen, as would typically occur. My palms rested on the wooden surface, and I could detect my own heartbeat pulsing in my fingertips. This wasn't anxiety. This wasn't nervousness. This represented something distinct. This was the sensation of arriving at a threshold from which there's no reversal. "Is Dion aware you're here?" The inquiry was rhetorical. I already possessed the answer, yet I required hearing it spoken aloud. I required confirmation of what I already understood, that my son had permitted this, that he'd participated in this scheme from its inception, that they'd both determined collectively that my agreement was unnecessary. Chloe released an extended, theatrical exhalation as though I were behaving unreasonably obstinate. "Naturally he's aware, Ava. Actually, it was his suggestion. He's currently completing some matters at his workplace, and he'll arrive later with the remainder of our belongings. I assumed he would have telephoned to inform you." "He didn't telephone, no. He hadn't telephoned, and that absence, that lack of a simple phone conversation, communicated everything I required, knowing. My son Dion, the child I'd nurtured single-handedly after his father vanished from our existence when he was merely 7 years old, the identical child I fed using income from my dual employment shifts, sanitizing offices, and serving beverages, the identical child who embraced me during his youth and declared that upon reaching maturity, he would care for me eternally. That precise son now regarded it completely acceptable to relocate into my residence without consultation, as though I were merely an appendage of his convenience, a resource available for his utilization. I approached the suitcases. I positioned myself before them, observing them as though they were extraterrestrial objects deposited from another dimension. They were costly. Those brands Chloe displayed on social platforms, pristine, presumably purchased during one of those excursions they embarked upon every couple of months, while I continued utilizing the identical worn luggage I'd acquired 15 years ago during a clearance event. You believed this was acceptable, arriving at my residence with your luggage without inquiring whether I was amenable, without considering for even one instant that perhaps I maintained plans, that perhaps I cherished my solitude, that perhaps I prefer not having individuals residing here. Chloe folded her arms across her torso, her stance transformed. She no longer presented as the relaxed, easygoing daughter, and now defensiveness permeated every aspect of her posture. Ava, you're Dion's mother. We constitute family. I fail to comprehend why you're complicating this situation. It's merely for a couple of days, perhaps 7 at most. It's not as though we're requesting something unreasonable. Furthermore, I assumed you'd appreciate having companionship. You frequently mention this place feels hollow. Hollow. The word reverberated in my consciousness like a funeral chime. Yes, I had once referenced that the residence felt quiet after my sister Olivia relocated to reside with her daughter last year. However, there existed an enormous distinction between quiet and hollow. My residence was quiet because I selected it that way. Because after decades of commotion, of obligations, of existing accessible to everyone except myself, I had finally discovered tranquility in the stillness. Yet Chloe had appropriated that informal confession and converted it into a rationalization, as though my instant of vulnerability granted her authorization to invade my territory, as though acknowledging occasional loneliness equated to pleading for someone to occupy every corner of my existence, without requesting my input. First, listen to me attentively. My voice descended to a lower register, yet maintained firmness. Chloe ceased moving. Something in my intonation compelled her to pay genuine attention for the first occasion since her arrival. This residence can feel however it desires to feel to me. It can be quiet or filled with noise. It can be hollow or complete. However, what it will never, ever become is accessible to anyone who determines to utilize it without my authorization. I am the owner of this residence, Chloe, not a convenient alternative when you two encounter a difficulty. She parted her lips to respond. Yet at that instant we detected the sound of a key rotating in the lock. The door swung open, and Dion, my son, entered carrying 2 additional bags and displaying that carefree grin he employed when he believed everything was manageable. Mom. Excellent timing. Chloe explained the situation to you, correct? We'll only remain here for 7 days, 14 at maximum. You won't even detect our presence. Dion's words floated through the air, as though they represented the most logical statement imaginable. He deposited the bags on the floor adjacent to the suitcases, brushed his palms on his trousers, and regarded me with that expression I recognized all too familiarly. It was the identical look he possessed when he was 12 years old and arrived home delayed after participating in basketball with his companions, anticipating I wouldn't become angry because he was simply being a typical child after all. Except Dion wasn't 12 anymore. He was 42. And I no longer represented that young, depleted mother who surrendered to every smile because I was excessively exhausted to engage in another conflict. I remained beside the dining surface, my palms still resting on the wood, observing him enter my apartment as though it were his own domain, as though the previous 40 years hadn't transpired, as though continuing to be his mother signified I had automatically relinquished any expectation of respect or consideration. Dion approached and attempted to deliver a kiss on my cheek. I didn't shift position, I didn't withdraw, yet I didn't lean forward either. I remained exactly where I stood, and he must have detected something in my posture, because he halted midway, a look of bewilderment briefly traversing his features before converting into a broader, more forced smile. "What's the matter, Mom? Did you experience a difficult day?" A difficult day, as though my reaction were the consequence of a transient mood, as though the issue was that I'd been required to wait excessively long in line at the financial institution, or that traffic had been congested. Not that my son and daughter-in-law had determined to relocate into my residence without consulting me. Not that they had treated me as though my perspective were irrelevant. Not that they had presumed my existence, my territory, my tranquility were resources accessible for their convenience. I didn't experience a difficult day, Dion. I experienced an unpleasant shock when I arrived home to discover your wife relocating here, without anyone inquiring whether I agreed. Dion chuckled, a genuine laugh as though he'd just received something amusing. He ran a palm through his hair, that gesture he executed when he believed someone was overreacting, and shook his head. "Mom, please don't be theatrical. I telephoned you twice this morning, and you didn't respond. I concluded you were absent, and we could get situated before your return. It's not that significant." I glanced over at Chloe, who was now positioned next to the suitcases with her arms still folded, observing the exchange with a combination of discomfort and something that dangerously resembled satisfaction, as though my confrontation with Dion was validating something she already suspected, that I was difficult, that I was unreasonable, that I represented the obstacle in a situation that should have been straightforward. "You telephoned twice, and when I didn't respond, you determined that constituted sufficient authorization to relocate into my residence." "We're not relocating in, Mom. We're simply staying for a couple of days." Dion progressed toward the kitchen, opened the refrigerator casually, grabbed a bottle of water I'd purchased that afternoon, and consumed straight from it. That minor gesture, so insignificant to any external observer, felt like a confirmation of everything I'd been contemplating. He perceived no distinction between his territory and mine. To him, my residence was an extension of his. My refrigerator, my food, my privacy, it was all part of a shared domain, where he maintained unlimited access. I closed my eyes momentarily, attempting to regulate the pressure accumulating in my chest. It wasn't anger yet. It was something deeper, older. It was the accumulated burden of decades of being the individual who always yielded, who always comprehended, who always positioned others' requirements before her own. It was the weariness of having expended my entire adult existence being useful, accessible, and convenient for everyone except myself. "How many days constitutes a couple of days, Dion?" He shrugged, still consuming the water, not regarding me directly. 7 days, 14, at maximum. The workers stated they'd complete rapidly. It's merely until we can rest in our own bedroom again without awakening to the sound of drilling at 6 in the morning. 14 days. 14 days of having 2 individuals in my territory, utilizing my bathroom, consuming my food, interrupting my routine. 14 days of not being able to traverse in my night clothes through my own living space if I awakened thirsty during the middle of the night. 14 days of being required to consider others' schedules before determining if I could observe my preferred show or listen to my music. 14 days of relinquishing the tranquility I had worked so arduously to construct after years of noise and chaos. And you simply presumed I'd be acceptable with that. Dion finally capped the water bottle and regarded me with something that attempted to resemble patience, yet was genuinely thinly concealed condescension. "Mom, you're my mother. Naturally, I presumed you'd be acceptable with it. What did you desire us to do? Remain in a hotel and expend $150 per night when you possess 2 unoccupied bedrooms here? That doesn't make logical sense. $150 per night." There was the genuine truth, naked and unadorned. It wasn't about requiring me. It wasn't about desiring to expend time with me. It was about finances, about economic convenience, about how utilizing my apartment without cost was more sensible than paying for their own comfort. And I, as always, was anticipated to comprehend, to be reasonable, to position their financial requirements above my emotional tranquility. Chloe cleared her throat from her position next to the suitcases. When she spoke, her voice had adopted that gentle, conciliatory tone individuals use when they desire to sound reasonable while manipulating a situation to their advantage. "Tava, we genuinely don't desire to cause you any difficulty. If it constitutes a problem, We can assist with expenses, perhaps $50 extra for utilities. We'll be utilizing water and electricity. It's only equitable we contribute $50, as though the issue were the cost of utilities, as though I could attach a price tag on my privacy, my routine, the quiet mornings where I sat on my balcony with a cup of coffee and simply existed without being required to be a mother, a mother-in-law, a hostess, or any other role others required me to perform. It's not about finances. Chloe. My voice emerged warier than I intended. Dion approached again, this time positioning a hand on my shoulder with that gesture he'd employed 1,000 times when he desired to soften me up. Then what is it about, Mom? Simply tell me what's disturbing you and we'll rectify it. You desire us to purchase the groceries. Perfect. No difficulty. You desire us to sanitize everything before we depart. We can accomplish that. 2. You don't desire us creating noise in the mornings. We'll be silent as mice. Tell me what you require and we'll accomplish it. What I required was for them to have inquired first. What I required was for them to have considered that perhaps I maintained the authority to decline. What I required was for them to comprehend that being family didn't signify having automatic access to every aspect of my existence without my consent. However, how could I explain that without appearing like the selfish mother, the difficult mother-in-law, the unreasonable woman who refused to assist her own family in a time of requirement? I gently relocated Dion's hand from my shoulder, not with abruptness, yet with sufficient firmness for him to recognize the gesture wasn't welcome presently. What I require, Dion, is for you to comprehend that this is my residence, not a hotel, not a backup alternative, not a resource accessible every occasion you encounter an inconvenience. It's the location where I reside, where I rest, where I maintain the authority to determine who enters and who remains. However, we're your family, Mom. His response was immediate, almost automatic, as though those 4 words were an irrefutable argument, as though the simple reality of sharing blood nullified any expectation of respect or consideration. And perhaps, for an extended time, I had believed that, perhaps for years I had accepted that being family signified always being accessible, always comprehending, always willing to sacrifice my own requirements for theirs. Yet something had transformed. Perhaps it was reaching 68 and realizing that time was no longer infinite. Perhaps it was the death of my companion Serena last year, who expended her final days regretting never having lived for herself. Perhaps it was simply the accumulated exhaustion of decades of being invisible in my own existence. Precisely because you are my family, this damages me more, Dion, because I would anticipate you more than anyone to comprehend that I also maintain a right to my territory, to my tranquility, to my determinations,